My study is based on understanding the trade relations between India and the ASEAN nations after the ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement known as the AIFTA. So, the ASEAN-India Framework Agreement on Comprehensive Economic Cooperation was signed on October 2003, which provided the legal basis for signing subsequent agreements, which included the Investment Agreement, the Trade in Goods Agreement, and the Trade in Services Agreement, which together make the AIFTA. The ASEAN-India Trade in Goods Agreement was signed and came into effect on the 1st of January 2010. Under this agreement, India and the ASEAN member nations have agreed to liberalize their respective markets by eliminating or simplifying taxes on goods for 76.4% of the total goods traded. So, there have been numerous studies on the trade between India and the ASEAN nations, but there has been a lack of sufficient research on the impact of the AIFTA on the exchange between India and the nations that are part of the ASEAN bloc, like Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. So this research aims to bridge the gap and identify the trade patterns between India and the ASEAN resulting from the AIFTA and understand its long-term implications for bilateral trade between them. So this study aims to achieve the following objectives. A. To identify differences in trade patterns between India and the ASEAN nations before and after the implementation of the AIFTA. B. To identify the products in which each nation has a comparative advantage and compare it with other countries in the ASEAN bloc. So, here, as we look at the data and the methodology, the data has been taken from the World Bank's World Integrated Trade Solution, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India, and Trading Economics. Figures on India's trade with ASEAN nations are obtained from 1997 to 2023. Then a trend line analysis of India's exports, imports, total trade and trade deficit during these years have been done. After that, an independent sample t-test has been done to test India's export and import performance to the ASEAN before and after the AIFTA. The before AIFTA period is 1997 to 2010 and after AIFTA period is 2010 to 2023. The null and the alternative hypothesis in this case are null hypothesis. There is no significant difference in India's average trade value to ASEAN before and after the AIFTA. Alternative hypothesis. India's average trade value to ASEAN before and after AIFTA differs significantly. Then a comparative advantage analysis of trade in goods of India and the ASEAN nations has been performed to analyze which products India has a comparative advantage while exporting to the ASEAN nations. So as we look at the trend analysis, this graph shows India's trade with the ASEAN bloc from 1997 to 2023. We can see that the exports, imports and the total trade have been on an increasing level. We can see that the trade deficit has been increasing over the years since the imports to the ASEAN have been greater than exports to the ASEAN. Now we look at exports to ASEAN nations from India from 1999 to 2023. In this graph, we see that the exports from India to Singapore have increased a lot during this period, and a similar pattern has been observed for Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, etc. We can, however, see that for Myanmar, Philippines, Brunei, Laos, and Cambodia, the increase has not been much. When we look at this graph represents India's imports from the ASEAN nations from 1999 to 2023. We can see an increasing trend in imports from Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, and not much of an increase from Myanmar, Philippines, Laos, or Cambodia. After conducting the independent sample test for India's trade with the ASEAN bloc before and after the AIFTA, we have seen that the T-stat is negative for exports and the p-value is very low, which has shown that The AIFTA agreement has had a strong positive impact on the exports of India to the ASEAN. If we look at the imports, the T stat here again is negative and the P value is much smaller than the significance level of 0.05. This proves that the AIFTA has significantly increased imports from ASEAN to India. Next, an independent sample t-test has been converted for imports of India to each ASEAN nation before and after the AIFTA. The results for these countries are quite varied. For Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines and Thailand, we see a substantial increase in imports. But for countries like Brunei, Laos, PDR and Cambodia, we see a marginal increase. Now, if we look at the exports, then we see that the exports to Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Thailand and Vietnam have increased quite a lot. But for Brunei, there has been no increase in average exports. For Laos and for Cambodia, there has been a marginal increase. Now, if we move to the comparative advantage analysis, there has been a destination-specific revealed comparative advantage carried out in order to find out which commodities India has a comparative advantage when it trades with the ASEAN nations individually. The following formula has been used where we can see we have taken country I exports in category J to country K and then world's exports in category J to country K divided by the country I's total exports to country K by the world's total exports to country K. If the value of the DSRC is greater than 1, India will enjoy a comparative advantage in trade of the concerned commodity with the concerned nation. If the DSRC is less than 1, India will not enjoy a comparative advantage in trade of the concerned commodity with the concerned nation. We can see the results of the comparative advantage here are as follows. For Brunei, India has a comparative advantage in nuclear reactors with Brunei since the value is greater than 1. For Cambodia and Indonesia and Laos, we see that India does not have a comparative advantage in any of the goods traded. For Malaysia, India has a comparative advantage in mineral fuels and precious stones. For Philippines, there is no comparative advantage in any good. India has a comparative advantage in mineral and precious stones with Singapore. With Thailand, it has a comparative advantage in precious stones and in nuclear reactors, as the values are greater than 1. For Vietnam, India has a comparative advantage in none of the mentioned goods. For Myanmar, we can see that except mineral fuels, India has a comparative advantage in precious stones, in nuclear reactors, in electronic equipment, and in plastics. Here are some policy recommendations to improve India's trade with the ASEAN. There should be diversification of exports between India and the ASEAN nations and support to specific sectors and MSMEs. There should be enhancement of comparative advantage in goods where India does not possess an advantage. Trade deficit between India and these nations should be addressed and import substitution should be looked at so that India allows more export and import between the nations. There should be more effective bilateral trade talks and negotiations. Non-tariff barriers are supposed to be addressed effectively so that trade can be facilitated easily. There should be more investment in infrastructure and logistics so that there is no problem in trading between these nations. There should be strong institutions for effective supervision as well. So the limitations of this study are the social and political factors have not been taken into the consideration while analyzing the trade relations between India and the ASEAN. And only the top 5 traded commodities have been included in this analysis, when more commodities could have been included for better analysis. This study should also include the non-tariff barriers into trade, which it has not. So the focus should be more on trade issues associated with AIFTA. with respect to the political and social consequences of the agreement. Thus, the AIFTA has been largely successful in enhancing trade between India and the ASEAN bloc, and economic ties are deeper between both the sides. But India's trade deficit has been rising post the implementation of AIFTA, which could leave India in an unfavorable position in global trade. Thus, we need to identify strategies that are required to promote India's export prowess with respect to the ASEAN bloc. And there should be further study on the long-term implications of the AIFTA and to determine non-tariff trade barriers and to find out how agreement affects specific industries in India and other member states of the ASEAN.